Hola, bienvenidos. Welcome to Spanish con Señora Bisbee. We're going to talk about two verbs today, saber versus conocer. So let's take a look. Now, these two verbs both mean to know, but we need to know their conjugations first. So let's talk about how to conjugate these verbs. They're both conjugated like normal ER verbs would be in the present tense, except for their yo forms. So the yo form of saber is se, so that's irregular, so we need to keep that in mind. Then the rest is sabes, sabe, sabemos, sabes, saben. Then for conocer, once again, we have a irregular yo form. This one actually fits in a pattern. So any verbs in Spanish that end in CER, in the yo form present tense, actually their C changes to a ZC to help with pronunciation. So we have conozco, conoces, conoce, conocemos, conoceis, conocen. So we've got our conjugations. So again, everything's normal except for the yo forms of each of these. So first step is memorizing those conjugations. So saber and conocer, they both mean to know, but in different contexts. We use one in certain situations and the other in other situations. If you've seen the verbs ser and estar, think of it like that. There's some scenarios where you need ser, there's some where you need estar, but they both mean to be. These two verbs work the same way. So when do we use saber? Well, we've got three scenarios we need to be aware of. Anytime we're talking about knowing facts or information, so by that I mean things that are just memorizable. You can just know them right off the top of your head. So for example, sé el nombre del profesor de arte. I know the name of the art teacher. That's just basic information that you just know right off the top of your head. It's memorizable. Anytime you want to say to know that and then continue with further information. For example, I know that it's going to be sunny today. I know that later this week I'm going to the beach. That, in this case, is represented by the word que, no accent. Now, something that's important to note when we use que in Spanish, if you haven't practiced with it as a relative pronoun before, it actually splits the sentence into two halves, or two clauses, so two portions. And each portion, because of this split, is allowed to have a separate conjugation. So we've got se conjugated on this side, and I conjugated on this side. So again, que splits, and now we conjugate on either side of it. It's kind of like if you were to make a sentence with when would do the same thing, or but, other conjunction words that would allow you to conjugate again. Those work in a similar fashion. But again, que, being a relative pronoun, gives us the ability to conjugate a second time due to making a new clause or portion of the sentence. So back to where we were. To know that. So in this example, sé que hay una prueba hoy. I know that there is a quiz today. So anytime we want to start a sentence with someone knows that, and then other information, voila, saber. And lastly, anytime we want to talk about knowing how to do something. Now, remember in Spanish that when we have two verbs side by side, we do not conjugate the second verb. It stays in infinitive. We only conjugate the first. So you'll notice that there's no word in between here, so the word how is not present. It's just implied by the structure of this sentence. So this one, sé crear una página web. I know how to create a web page. So anytime we want to talk about knowing how to do something, that requires saber. Alright, now let's move on to the verb conocer. So basically, instead of thinking about conocer as just to know, think about it more like to be familiar with something. So it's like you've heard of something, but it's something that's too big to memorize. So where are we going to see this typically? Well, with people. You might have been someone's best friend for your whole life, but you're never going to be able to read their minds. You're never going to know everything about them. So we use conocer with people. Now, in Spanish, when we use an action and it's received by a person, so in this case, knowing, and then what's being known, a person, we have to add a personal a, and you can check out our other videos to see how to use personal a. But basically, it's a giveaway for conocer. So like if you had fill in the blanks with saber and conocer, and there was a blank here, and you saw Maria, That should be your giveaway. Oop, that's a conocer situation. We're talking about knowing a person. So anytime in Spanish an action is received by a person, we just stick a before them to give them a little bit more respect. It doesn't translate to anything. So conozco a Maria, I know Maria. Okay. Another thing that we can't fully memorize, but we can hear of or know of, places. You might have lived somewhere your whole life. You might have really explored it, loved it, wonderful. But there's still going to be parts that you don't know about that place. There's still going to be unknowns to you. So for example, conozco Boston bien. I know Boston well. I might have lived there my entire life, but I'm still not going to be able to know every little thing about the place. Another example that comes up quite a bit, websites. You can't really memorize a website like you're familiar with it, you've heard of it, but even if you've used something all the time, you don't have it all memorized. So you're saying like you've heard of it, you've seen it. Conozco un sitio web para conjugaciones. I know a website for conjugations, like I've heard of one. And then lastly, to be well-versed in an area. So think about like different topics or maybe academic skills, for example. So conozco that was awful. Conozco el álgebra bien. I know algebra well. I might be a math expert, but some things are just too big to memorize, such as academic subjects. You might be really good at it, but there's always things you're going to need to look up and look into, and that's okay. But it's more like being familiar with something. It's too big to memorize. So when you run into these well-versed in area situations, that's going to use conocer as well. So similar back to when you learned ser versus estar, you can write the same sentence with either verb, but what you're saying changes. The meaning you're expresses changes. So what's the difference with saber and conocer? If I say the same sentence but switch out the verbs, I've changed what I'm implying. So if I say yo sé el alfabeto, I know the alphabet. With saber, I'm implying that I have it memorized. I could repeat the whole thing to you, no problem. Versus, yo conozco el alfabeto. More like I've heard of it or I'm familiar with it. So, exact same sentence, I just swapped out the verb, but the meaning changes based on which verb you choose. Facts and information with saber, conocer more to be familiar with. So just be aware that that's the overarching difference between the two. Alright, and that's saber versus conocer. It's pretty simple. Step 1, make sure you know the conjugations of each of these verbs. Remember, in the present tense, they both have irregular yo forms, but everything else is normal. Step 2, know when to use each verb. So remember that saber, we use it to know facts and information, so memorizable things. We use it for to know that, and we use it to say to know how to do something. Conocer, on the other hand, we know that it's more like to be familiar with, so more often than not, you'll see this verb with people, places, things that are too big to memorize, like things you've heard of, like, oh, I've heard of a great website that can help you with this, or perhaps being well versed in a certain area. So for example, the mechanic really knows cars well. You might be an expert at cars, but you're not going to know every little thing, so it's more like to be familiar with. And that's saber versus conocer. It takes a little practice to get used to, but it's a great way to show that you really have a concrete understanding of Spanish verbs. Gracias, nos vemos, y buena suerte.